Sidetrack episode 47, Daniel and Enoch hiding in plain sight. Welcome back to A2Z History Presents The History of the Papacy. The History of the Papacy podcast is a proud member of the Agora podcast network. We are a group of independent podcasters. Our goal is to create thought-provoking and high-quality podcasts. The Agora Podcast Network show of the month is Ben Jacobs' Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast. I think this is the record amount of plugs for one podcast in 1 month. So if you listen to my show before, you know how great Ben's podcast is. You should definitely be listening to it. Learn more at agorapodcastnetwork.com. As we've said in the past, this show is now on Patreon, patreon.com/papacy to be precise. If you've ever thought of supporting the show, Patreon's a great way to do it. You can set up a monthly donation. Different levels of support have unique rewards, so definitely check it out. This time, I'd like to send out a big shout-out and thank you to our latest Antioch-level patron, David. Thank you to our Constantinople-level patrons, Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, and Dr. Jeff. Now, this is the third installment of Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse. In this episode, we're featuring two important books of the apocalyptic genre of Second Temple Jewish writings, the Book of Daniel and the Book of Enoch. Both books included incredibly vivid imagery and fascinating details. Interestingly, one book made it into the canons of almost every Christian faith and into the Jewish canon, and one generally did not make it in. You'll have to listen to find out. So let's find out why. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the apocalypse. It is, after all, nigh. Welcome back to Steve and Gary's Guide to the Apocalypse. We are going to do our very best to prepare you for the apocalypse. Today we'll talk.
Sorry.
And today we'll talk about the fascinating books of Daniel and Enoch. There's so much to talk about these incredible documents. So let's dig in. Are you excited, Gary?
Oh, I am excited. I've always been excited about the apocalypse. Apocalypse now. That's what we want. Apocalypse now.
Okay, Steve. Now, one thing about Daniel. As I said, it's a lot more popular with Christians than with Jews, and here's a good reason. Here's Daniel 7:11. I looked on. Then because of the arrogant words that the horn spoke, the beast was killed as I looked on. Its body was destroyed, and it was consigned to the flames. The dominion of the other beasts was taken away, but an extension of life was given to them for a time and season. As I looked on, in the night vision, one like a human being came with the clouds of heaven. He reached the Ancient of Days and was presented to him. Dominion, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples and nations of every language must serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship one that shall not be destroyed in the end of days. Now, the translation I just gave you is from the Jewish Study Bible, so it's a Jewish translation. And 7:13, where I said, as I looked on in the night vision, one like a human being came with the clouds of heaven. In Christian Bibles, that's translated as I looked on in the night vision, one like a son of man came with the clouds of heaven. So that whole passage is taken to be referring to Jesus Christ in the Christian tradition. In the Jewish tradition, it's taken to be referring to maybe a Messiah, maybe just a human being. And the introductory section of that part of Daniel, where it's talking about the arrogant words that the horn spoke, the beast was killed, that's referring to the earlier beasts, which Daniel was mentioning in his vision, where he talks about a lion, a bear, leopard. And these are all taken to be references, coded references to enemies of Israel, Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. And in particular, where Daniel talks about something called the horn, that's taken to be referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Greek king who desecrated the temple.
And it seems like in a lot of Daniel, the Christians really were able to sink their teeth into it, like the 3 youths in the furnace.
That's true, where the angel appears.
Yeah, inside of the furnace. And isn't there also interpretation of it that Jesus was in the furnace with them?
Yes, I think the Christians interpret the figure as Jesus. Yeah. So Daniel's a lot more popular with Christians who believe that they see a lot of prefiguration of Christ in it. And then that's another reason why it's just not that popular in Judaism.
Yeah, you can see how that one, if the Christians were really getting into it and they're taking an idea from it, that it might have turned off the early post-Second Temple Jews.
Yes, and as I said, they weren't keen on the idea of resurrection. And actually, here's the passage in Daniel which mentions the resurrection of the dead, and it's really quite brief. So Daniel 12:2. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. That's it. That is the entire reference in Daniel to some sort of resurrection from the dead.
So now we're moving forward a little bit to our next apocalypse, Enoch. What can you tell us about Enoch?
First Enoch is the earliest, we think, and most important of the apocalyptic books. First Enoch comes out of nowhere, absolutely out of nowhere. We do understand it to be really very early, probably earlier than Daniel. So that's an interesting fact in itself. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know where the ideas came from. The whole apocalyptic genre suddenly explodes with First Enoch. And I'll give you a little quote from First Enoch because it encapsulates the entire genre in itself. Okay. First Enoch 1:1. These are the words of the blessing of Enoch, according to which he blessed the chosen and righteous, who must be present on the day of distress, which is appointed for the removal of all the wicked and impious. And Enoch began his story and said, There was a righteous man whose eyes were opened by the Lord, and he saw a holy vision in the heavens, which the angels showed to me. And I heard everything from them, and I understood what I saw, but not for this generation, but for a distant generation that will come. So that encapsulates the whole thing. He's seeing a vision from an angel. It's hidden knowledge. It's not intended for today's people. It's intended for an elect in the future. And the book then continues, and it's a very long book. It's something like 40,000 English words. That's about as long as Genesis. And Genesis is one of the longest books in the Old Testament. So it's huge. First Enoch seems to consist of 6 separate sections which were created at varying points and then eventually put into one document. The most important and the oldest part is called the Book of the Watchers. And this is the story of the Watchers as in people who watch. And these are taken to be the fallen angels who fathered the Nephilim, the giants, which are mentioned in Genesis. So it introduces angels. It introduces Azazel, Semyaz. The sin of Semyaz was to mate with humans. The sin of Azazel was to reveal secrets to humanity, secrets like metalworking and pottery and all that sort of stuff.
Are these angels, are they gods, divine, or are they something in between divine and created? Or
the watchers or angels in Enoch are fallen angels. And again, this is the first reference to a fallen angel in Jewish literature. People who are acting either against God's will or who've been thrown out of heaven. First Enoch 6:1. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semyaz was their leader, and said to them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they answered him and said, and then it goes on and lists a whole bunch of angels to say, yep, we're going to have sex with human women, and it's going to be a lot of fun, and even though God will object, who cares?
Who is Enoch?
Enoch is the 7th patriarch after Adam. The literature was attributed to Enoch because he's the first man in human history, according to the Bible, to mysteriously disappear. All the patriarchs are said, to have gone to meet their maker or fallen asleep, gone to join their fathers, except for Enoch. Enoch is said to have walked with God. So Enoch gets a special status. This is a guy who, we don't know what happened to him. He walked with God. Does that mean he died? No, it means he walked with God. The only other person in the Old Testament like that is Elijah. who disappears in a cloud of flame or whatever. They're the only two mysterious disappearances in the Old Testament. So Enoch gets all this stuff attributed to him because his disappearance is so mysterious.
And that's all canonical?
Oh, yeah, that's canonical. About Enoch, yeah. Quote, Genesis 5:21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So that's the mysterious disappearance. And it entranced people for centuries.
Because they would have said if he died, he went with the fathers, or
yes,
et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely some other meaning that they're trying to get across there.
There certainly is. We don't know exactly what the author of Genesis was trying to imply, but certainly very early on, readers understood it as Enoch not dying, because all the other patriarchs are quite clearly stated as saying, I think the typical phrase is they slept with their fathers, and Enoch doesn't sleep with his fathers.
And who wrote, well, there's 5 books of Enoch out there?
Yes, I think there's either 4 or 5 books of Enoch, but that's mainly because since Enoch had this status, if you were going to write something which you really wanted to impress people with, as we discussed earlier, you'd attribute it to some dude. So, Enoch is a grand choice. The other books of Enoch are a real motley collection, spread over centuries and centuries. For example, the book known as the Second Book of Enoch. Some people think it was Jewish. It was written about 150 AD. Other people think that it's Christian and it was written in Byzantine times, about 800 AD. And the other books, 3, 4, 5 Enoch, are all equally obscure. It's only really First Enoch that we need to worry about. All the others, you just say, weird, just weird.
And so, I mean, that's such a huge date span. It could mean anything. The origin, if you're talking 150 AD, that's a big difference between 800 AD.
Well, yeah, exactly. And scholars can't agree if it's really Jewish or if it's really Christian. So that's how ambiguous the book is.
I mean, that makes it pretty much meaningless to draw any big, grander narratives out of it if you can't even say if it was Jewish or Christian.
Exactly. But of course, that hasn't stopped scholars.
No, sure.
And everyone has their own pet theory. I'm sure that there must be dozens of people specializing in Second Enoch who've spent their entire careers defending their pet theory.
And First Enoch, who considers that canonical?
That's only considered canonical by the Ethiopians, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And we have them to thank, actually, for preserving it. Until we discovered material in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was the only evidence that we had for First Enoch. And European scholars only discovered First Enoch in the late 1700s.
Do any of the other churches or Jewish groups accept any of the other Enochs?
No one accepts any of the other Enochs in any form whatsoever. They're just manuscripts that we've found. I don't think any of the other Enochs appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, they can't. They're much, much too late. They're just sort of hanging around out there.
That's fascinating. So the Enochs, they were a big deal for a while and then just completely vanished off the radar?
They seem to have vanished. If we just look at First Enoch, because all the other Enochs are, fan fiction, basically. The Enochian literature seems to have been important early on. Apparently, the manuscripts we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to date from fairly early on in the Qumran community's life, around about the time of Maccabees. And then they stopped either copying or writing about them, and they seem to have lost interest. And certainly Judaism never showed any interest in either First Enoch or the rest of the apocalyptic literature, except for the remnants that survive in Jewish mysticism.
But in the Christian context, it really did lay a lot of the base for Christian theology.
It certainly did. Apparently First Enoch was considered as scriptural in the Epistle of Barnabas. A lot of the early church fathers, like Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, Tertullian, they all believed that First Enoch was canonical, and it only really fell out of favour in the early formal years of the church after Constantine, when they actually sort of came up with the canon, and First Enoch was looking even a bit too crazy for them. Maybe it's a case of, First Enoch or Revelations? First Enoch or Revelations? Let's go with Revelations.
And just a matter of that Enoch was so massive
That's true. It is huge. It really is huge. And as I said, it does seem to be a composite work of several different things. And we don't really know when the whole lot was assembled together. I mean, some parts of it are really, I don't know why you'd include them in an ebook. For example, 10 chapters are basically a solar calendar. And it talks about astrology and the months of the year and that sort of thing. Actually, that's another interesting thing about First Enoch and the apocalyptic literature. They all advocate a solar calendar. I mean, as we know, Judaism has a sort of a wacky lunar calendar where every so often they have to insert a new month for various reasons. First Enoch and the other apocalypticists are very keen on saying, no, let's ditch the lunar calendar because it's crazy. Let's have a nice solar calendar of 360 days a year and maybe a couple of extra days if it all gets out of whack. But let's do that. I don't know why they were so keen on a solar calendar, but it seems to be a major theological point. It's like the distinction of, shall we do the gold standard or the silver standard back in early 20th century America or late 19th century?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's it's like that. People are saying, no, we must have the gold standard. It's the only viable sort of currency. Others are saying, no, silver. It's fine. But I don't know why the emphasis on the solar calendar or what's so evil about the lunar calendar.
That's fascinating in its own right.
Yeah. Some people tie the solar calendar thing into the fact that Enoch lived for 365 years, but I'm not sure how viable that is because I don't know how many people actually thought that the year was 365 days long. I don't know if they'd actually worked that out. I mean, didn't that only happen in Julius Caesar's time? They really had an accurate length of the year?
I think so. I think that other people may have had a solar calendar, but I don't know if they had worked it out to that 365 number at that early point in the West. I think maybe the Aztecs or the Mayan had a calendar worked out to that degree, but I don't think any of that they would have even had it that early. Not that that would have influenced anything anyways.
Yeah.
As far as Enoch goes.
So I think if the Romans couldn't get it right, then I don't see why there'd be a lot of people saying, oh, you know, everyone knows that the year's 365 days long, so how come our calendar doesn't match it? Ooh, I don't know.
Yeah.
So it must not have been well known.
And even the Jewish calendar, that solar lunar, like you said, how they have to cut and paste a month in there.
Exactly. They have to cut and paste a month. I once asked a good Jewish friend of mine how he knows, you know, when the high holidays are happening and all that sort of thing. And he says, well, every year we get a little book from Israel and it's got the calendar in it. And that's how we know what day of the month, what month it is. I mean, that's the equivalent of Christians have to be told when is Easter this year or have an elaborate system for calculating it. But in the Jewish system, it's not just one date in the year. It's the entire calendar.
Yeah, and when you have to physically figure things out from an actual observation of the moon.
Yeah, yes, exactly. From an observation of the moon. And from what I understand, the insertion of the intercalary month is decided by some given authority. It's not regular. I don't think. Could be wrong. It's like someone says, okay, time to have an extra month. It doesn't happen regularly, like every 13 years or something.
Because isn't it that because certain of the holidays are like Passover's a spring holiday, and if it went straight lunar calendar, it could wind up at any time of the year practically.
That's true. If you've only got 12 months and you have to keep inserting a 13th one every so often, it could shift. Actually, I noticed this year Passover seemed to differ quite a lot. I think that 3 or 4 weeks from Easter. It's only Passover recently.
Yeah, it was about a week ago.
Yeah, and Easter was a good month ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's just like in the, I believe in Islam, they use a straight lunar calendar, and Ramadan goes backwards every year. It's a little bit earlier in the year.
Do they insert extra months to make up for it, or do they just keep going?
I don't believe so, but I'd have to look that up a little bit more. But I don't think that they do add like a leap month to rectify the year to match the actual year, like the seasons.
I must admit, having a lunar calendar must be a lot easier for the everyday man, mustn't it? Because you just look up, is it a full moon? Okay, new month or whatever, as opposed to any other system of measuring. So I can see the sense of having a lunar calendar. Yeah, it just doesn't fit the year.
Yeah, especially before ways to calculate those things. Yeah, it's easy. It's the next month because we've gone through it full cycle of the moon. How else would you measure it by?
As opposed to measuring when is the longest day of the year or the shortest day of the year.
And even that doesn't, that's only setting 2 data points.
That's true. You're only setting 2 data points. You wouldn't know what the date was otherwise unless you had a big chalkboard somewhere and you marked off every single day. And who's going to do that?
And if you live on the equator, it really doesn't tell you anything anyways. But then seasons wise, I mean, any season, how can you really tell if it's planting time if the weather might get really warm a month early than it normally does, or it could stay cold a month later? That doesn't really tell you anything.
No, that's true too. The only people who might have some greater fix on it would be the Egyptians and the inundation of the Nile.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone else is just wandering around looking at the moon, I suppose.
So we talked about that the Jewish interpretation of Enoch, they just weren't into Enoch.
No, not at all.
And the early Christians, some of them were really into it, like the Ethiopians and the Eritreans really stuck to it.
Yes, and apparently it had a lot of influence on the modern Ethiopian Orthodox Church in that in their theology they attribute sin to these fallen angels. There's no concept of Adam and Eve as the origination of sin. It all comes down to these evil angels, which makes a lot of theological sense, really. I mean, it's easy to understand.
And can you speak more to the angels, the fallen angels, and all these different hosts of angels and degrees of angels?
I can give you a quote from a passage from 1 Enoch, which I suppose would be typical of it. For example, 1 Enoch 8:1. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, the art of working them, and bracelets. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Semiez taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armoros, the resolving of enchantments. Bara, some name I can't pronounce, taught astrology. Cockabel, the constellations. Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel, the signs of the earth. Shamsiel, the signs of the sun. And Sariel, the course of the moon. So, whoa, whole bunch of angels. And these are the bad guys, mind you. And they're teaching humanity all this stuff, which obviously is not going down that well with God, apparently. So this whole hierarchy of angels, well, actually, it's not presented as a hierarchy. It's presented more like a host. There's just a host of angels. There's bad angels and there's good angels. And the bad angels are the ones who had sex with humans and brought us knowledge. And knowledge is not a good thing. Just look at the tree of knowledge. Look what happened to Eve.
Does their naming convention give any indication of when they were written? Like a lot of the angels seem to have the L name in them.
Yeah, they do. I have absolutely no idea. And my attempts at pronunciation, I wouldn't fully trust them, but you're quite right. There's a lot of L. The L name seems quite common in the good angels too, isn't it? I mean, Michael, Gabriel. I can't think of any other angels at the minute, good angels. There's Michael and Gabriel. Can't think of any others. I don't know what the naming convention is, but you're quite right that L, which is a root name for God in various Canaanite languages, seems to be quite common. Where they came from, I have absolutely no idea.
I mean, just that whole angel thing, it's like, where do they come from? And when you have a religion that's monotheistic, to have these semi-divine things floating around, it seems like it's tough to explain.
I think, yes, it is. Because as I said, first Enoch just comes out of nowhere. So one minute you have the Israelites, nice strict monotheism, and then during the late Persian, early Maccabean period, suddenly someone comes up with something which is manifestly not monotheistic. It's almost polytheistic.
Mm-hmm.
I'd really like to talk to that guy and say, well, how did you come up with this, man? Have you been to India or something?
And you mentioned that this is the first where we get introduced to the concept of hell or an imprisonment. That's
true. This is the first time we really find a concept of hell. And here's where it first occurs. 1 Enoch 10:11. And the Lord said unto Michael, who's a good angel, Go, bind Semyaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation. In those days they shall be led off to the abyss of fire, and to the torment and the prison, in which they shall be confined forever. So here is the very first concept of a hell in which people will go to be judged and punished. And it's a pretty big punishment, you must admit.
And the Christians really grabbed on to that.
Yes, they certainly did. It must have been a major influence on people, because this notion of hell and angels or bad people being punished does run through First Enoch quite a lot. And it must be the Christian origins of hell. It can't come from anywhere else that I can think of.
And it really does. It goes back into this idea that there was a lot of ideas floating around out there, and you could pick what you wanted to. Some people picked these certain things, and other people picked these, and groups died out, merged together, split off again.
Yeah, exactly. The Christians picked the idea of hell. The Jews said, no, not interested. We'll leave that one on the shelf.
We hope you'll pick up listening the next part of our series. We're not done with apocalypses yet.
No.
Tune in next time when we'll talk more about books and more apocalypses.
You wouldn't believe how many apocalypses there are. Oh, we could go on for years. Until the apocalypse.
And we're well on our way.
We are.